Okie dokie. Righty ho then. Good evening. So it's just a little thing that I've been preparing the last little while is some projections on, South African. The growth rate is like some main indicators. So I mean, if you look over here, so I've got. So this is taken from the medium-term budget estimate. So there's a report that the Treasury puts out every year that gives you the projections for the next 3 years as well as reports on the past two. And so I took all of the outcomes for the past few years and placed them in. So you've got South African rands, and then I did the US dollar conversion for that year because the report's published in March. So I took the conversion rate for US dollars for the 1st of March that year. And and then there's like a few basic ratios that are good indicators of economic health and so on. So there are a couple of thresholds to bear in mind. One of them is well, both of them are basically what the thresholds that are academically understood to be when a state gives a debt default or goes into hyperinflation. And so those are so the two ratios that you want are for debt to GDP, it's around 90%. And then there's a really scary one, which is called the Bernholz ratio. Now, the Bernholz ratio is when you have your, where is it here? It's not debt to revenue, it's, sure, but this is double tracked. I'm going to ignore that chart, unfortunately. Any weasel. It is deficit to expenditure ratio. So if your deficit is 40% of your expenditure, things look really, really bad. And no country has sustained that for more than a year. We actually touched the Bernholz ratio. We got 39%, hit the 39% point briefly during the last year of lockdown, and I'll show you that just now. So I don't know why this is double. Well, I'll do this. I'll do this later. Let's have a look. I know what I did here. Never mind. You have to ignore this one. So these are just straight up what's going on for the past 10 years. Here are the past 10 years plus a projection up till 2030. So these are ratios on the one side, and these are just the straight figures on the other. And so let's have a little zoom in. Now, what I basically did here is I took the growth rate, the average growth rate for each one of these projections, based on an average of the past 10 years, average of the first 5 years of those 10 years, and average of the second 5 years of those 10 years. And so, you can see debt overtaking GDP in 2029, in 2030, and around 2028 over there. So it depends, which one you go through. We can see this nasty little spike over here where the figures cross over here, where the private sector is overshadowed by debt, where the deficit spikes over here and revenue goes down, expenditure goes up. This is where COVID happens. The interesting one here is if you take the ratios. Now, it's very difficult to read if you've got all of them together because your ratio of debt to expenditure and debt to revenue are very high. But if you take those away, and you apply them, so now you can see things a little bit more clearly. So I just wanted you to have a brief look at those two figures before I took them away, because they're absolutely nasty. Oh, you silly. Okay, and then that one, I don't know. I think I selected the wrong fields there. before I did that line graph. But over here, we can see the really nasty one. So there you can see everything after 2022 over here is, a projection. So everything from here is a projection. This is real values, real historical values. But it really is very steep. I mean, even before we go into COVID, you can already see the debt to GDP is starting to trend up quite severely. The ratio between the revenue that we're taking in and the private sector is, sort of flatlined, more or less, slight decline. That doesn't mean that we can extract much more taxation from people, because we're already well beyond our Laffer curve optimum. So the Laffer curve optimum is for South Africa is 18% of GDP, based on, would have been in 2009. That's based on a study that I'll have to dig up. But I've actually got a graph that I took out of here. So let me just open it up, and then let me see. Sorry, Lovey, I'm sharing my screen at the moment. I'm on a thingy, so it's okay. Right. Let me just try and see. I'll share my screen for a minute, and then okay, Laffer curve. Ha! There we go. Now, let's say stop screen, and then we go. Okay, here we go. Now, I can't really share much of this report, but I'm going to share this a little bit. So there's a couple of guys called Skumer and Van Heerden who did, and I'm just going to read this out because it's worth bearing in mind. So if you don't know what the Laffer curve is just, it assumes that on the one hand side, let's go up here and look at this. So it says that you've got, there's a certain ideal maximum amount of revenue that you can extract from tax. So if you take 100% of the taxation, then the economy can't grow or do anything because no one can do anything. And if you take nothing, you get nothing. So it's like a very sort of simple idea, but right in the middle, there's some sort of sweet spot, right? So there's a very interesting model where they took this based on the economy in 2008, 2009, and we get this curve. Now the ideal is there's somewhere around like 80%. But where we've been collecting somewhere off to the right-hand side, off the chart, at around 26, 27%, right? And you must look at the assumptions that they made based on this return. So, I mean, trying to put this in my model would take a very long time because I'd have to learn a few bits of math. But so I'll just read this out. They found the state has really well exceeded the rate of taxation optimal for economic growth and would have to reduce it if the economy and state budget were to be sustainable. Using a model based off of a comparison of state and non-state driven economic growth factors, and here's the important point, on the assumption that the state revenue is all productive state expenditure. Now, I mean, we know that most state expenditure is relatively wasteful, or it's maintenance of, like welfare and things like that don't necessarily transfer into productivity. And I mean, that's an enormous estimation. I imagine that with the inefficiencies that we've got in our government, that peak would actually be somewhere down here at 15% or perhaps a little bit lower. Given those inefficiencies. I mean, even if we had, say, a really competent government, and I'll take, the DA as an example, because they're our most competent party in terms of, governance, we should be expecting, we should be expecting that Laffer curve to be significantly lower than this, because this is sort of like an ideal scenario where there is no waste, and even a really competent government wastes to some extent. So, Yeah, I think that's I think that should go that should go without saying. So I am going to go back to the Doom Spaghetti again. Oh, do come on. And that looks so. I think one of the things that we're going to have to bear in mind here is so depending on where our growth rates and stuff is, we should sort of trundle along at a sort of okay rate for well, very unhealthy and sclerotic, but we should do sort of we shouldn't necessarily collapse, because in this scenario where you've got the same average growth rate as the past decade, we could expect that this line over here, this red line that says debt on the left hand side in the projected figures, not the ratios but the normal projections, we should expect that to sort of decline somewhat, because we won't be taking on that much new debt. We'll be paying off existing debt and reevaluating it. So that should actually go down, and then this ratio graph, the gray line of debt to GDP, should sort of start flatlining at around 2025-ish, I'd imagine. But it's still not very healthy, and any sort of major economic shock would put us back where we were over here under COVID very, very easily. I mean, we've also got a whole bunch of other things that are going on that are going to negatively impact this. So number one is Eskom. It cannot be repaired in time for this. It won't be sort of back up to scratch, and will likely collapse in the next year or a couple of years. So that you can sort of say, I mean, sure, but I mean, considering just that factor, you can actually just leave these things as they are, as nasty as they are. But the really sort of scary scenario is this one over here, where all of our figures remain the same as they were for the past, based on the past 5 years, not the past 10 years, or not even the middle section over here, which is from the 2012 to 2017 average growth rate. Because that one's a little bit healthier, and it'll take us. You'll see the deficit will slowly decline, and the revenue as a percentage of public sector will grow ever so slightly. But the really scary one is, look, if the next 7 years are like the past 5. We can expect ourselves to hit like a default or hyperinflation event around 2027. So we're in a very, very risky scenario. So I mean, the thing is, for me, Peter Bernholz's work that was recommended to me by Russell Lamberti. Russell Lamberti, really, really like a guy. I can't remember what his exact title is. I think he's CEO or something of Sarkelicha. And so, I mean, he's an economist. He's sort of Mises school guy. Mises, Austrian economics guy. But he suggested to me Peter Bernholz's book on, hyperinflation events. And the guy studies all hyperinflation events throughout the 20th century and early 21st, and says, here we go. If you hit this ratio, this particular indicator of, deficit to revenue, if it hits 40%, you cannot sustain that for a year without going into like catastrophic hyperinflation or debt default, which, as far as he's concerned, are roughly about the same thing in terms of their effect on, on the financial markets. In terms of its effect on your public fiscus, of course, it's very different, and it's going to be very different for people on the ground. But debtors look at it in the same way, and when you get to that point, you'll start seeing people, dumping investment very, very hard. So. I don't know what to say. This is running these numbers has not made me feel particularly good, because it sort of says to me, so like I look at this and I go, okay, well, let's say you get there's a couple of scenarios that we're going through right now, and I mean, if you guys have ever had a look at France Crenier, So he does a lot of lovely little projections about which things are going to go, but he's feeling very optimistic, and he thinks, uh, he thinks things will be fine. He thinks we'll go into coalition, a DA-ANC coalition, and it'll be fine, and nothing bad will happen if that happens, and we'll balance the budget and everything. I just don't see it happening. Look, I make a big deal out of this because I think it's a really awful idea. Look, I've made these arguments a dozen times, so I'm not going to yank your chain about it too much. But suffice it to say, the DA does not have the leverage to. Is there a dog under my table? Yes. Hello. So the DA doesn't really have much leverage. So there are projections that say the DA will fall below 40%. I'm not so sure I buy that. I think I'd love to see the methodology on those polls before I give them too much credit. If you're being optimistic, sure, that is now certainly within the range of possibilities. If they fall that low, obviously you'd have to have a ruling coalition of ANC, DA, and possibly even another small party. So I don't know. I don't know how that's going to work out, but it would mean that the ANC would have to form a coalition with either the DA or a very long list of small parties, including the EFF. So there are not a lot of options for the ANC if they fall that low. I think the likelihood, though, is that they'll stay in the 40s, and they'll have three coalition partners available, and that's IFP, EFF, and DA. And I think what will happen in that scenario next year is that the DA will approach them and say, we want to form a coalition, and the ANC will go, well, okay, well, what are your conditions? What do you want? And Helen Siller will tell them, well, we want an independent. These are what Richie lines up. So privatize all SOEs, great idea. Have an independent commission for investigating corruption, yes, also a good idea. And then scrap all race-based legislation, also a fantastic idea. However, what this is going to do is it's overnight going to kill all of the ANC's patronage. That's not going to happen, and also it's going to mean pretty much everyone ends up going to jail, and so the likelihood that this is going to be settled on is very, very slim. And so either the DA are not going to make those the conditions, or they're not going to go into coalition. That's how I see it. So I don't think that's going to work out. So if we get a DA coalition, you won't see anyone going to jail. And the other thing is, to keep the coalition in power, they're going to have to lay off attacking their coalition partners, which means. Well, it means the DA will be sitting up there saying, you're in bed with corruption, and they'll say, we decline to comment. It's not going to work out. People who can work with them, I think, again, best option, ANC IFP. It won't change any of this nasty doom spaghetti that you see over here. But it will mean that for the few years that you have going, sorry, Robert King left a very amusing comment. I'll address your guys' comments in a minute. So, yeah, I really like to see the IFP in charge, because what it means is you don't get the chaos of a DA ANC coalition. It means the DA remains intact. They'll be very embarrassed by their attempt to go into a coalition with the ANC, which they've been advertising for a while. But I don't think that it means. I think that it means that they'll broadly remain intact. They'll take a little bit of a knock at the polls, particularly in the Cape, but from making an offer like that. But they won't die. But if they go into coalition with the ANC, the next election they'll do terribly, because they can't change anything. They'll be able to exert some influence to have some areas of the budget cut, maybe arrange a bit of privatization, but there are a lot of toxic assets on the spreadsheet, and like people are just not willing to invest. I was very fortunate. I got into a short thingamabob Twitter space where Songeso Zibi, who is one of the presidential candidates for a very small party that's affiliated with like Open Society Foundation, Braintrust Foundation, all of those sort of liberal, funny groups. And I sort of I quoted some of the projections I had where I said, we're headed, we are headed in this direction. This is where we're going. And we're going to have to we're going to have to cut shed loads of spending in order to function. And he goes, yeah, I know that, but we can't cut welfare. We need to increase welfare because people are suffering. And we can't privatize the SOEs because no one wants to buy them. So what we will be seeing is electricity will be cut to most of the townships at the very least. There's going to be a lot of violence in the coming decades. So the only real option is Cape independence and enclave separatism. So there's a third option. But this requires massive balls. And that is that the private sector and civil society gets together and boycotts the state, basically removes all taxation. Now, if they did this tomorrow, they'd only have to confiscate, they'd only have to withhold 1/3 of revenue, not even that. I'd say probably actually, but one of my estimates came out at like 25%. They'd only have to take off 25% of the revenue, which is possible, although there are some severe coordination issues. So you'd need, what you'd need is employers' organizations to facilitate this, and you'd need civil society, some civil society body to be the real. So they'd have to be the facilitator. The employers' organizations would have to be someone who says, "Why don't you work with them?" Because there's some laws that basically mean that if you're an employers' organization, you can't do this directly. You'd run into all kinds of legal issues. But I mean, not that you wouldn't run into legal issues anyway. But anyway, my basic sort of point over here is that there are very few options left. There's tax revolt, there's Cape secession. Let's just divide into the interior and the Cape. The Cape can secede. That's it. That's all. That's the only option for the Cape. And the interior, they've got two options, which are not mutually exclusive. Now, one is a tax revolt, and the other one is enclave separatism. And that means that if you're white, you get out to a small number. There are areas where you can go to. A lot of them are like in Pretoria. There's some towns in Mpumalanga. There's some towns in the Northwest and Free State and the Northern Cape. Although fewer. There's a couple in Limpopo actually. But basically, you get out there and you just up sticks and move. And this depends on how well Cape Independence is going, because I imagine a lot of people are going to be flying down to the Cape and trying to get set up here. But it's I don't see us getting out of this without very drastic action. So DA, some of their noises are just, they're getting delusional. And I think part of it's that they've invested themselves so deeply into their particular strategy that it's no good. I mean, look, I have word from friends of mine who spoke to Alan Windy. Go check out Worldview. They do really, really great, nice clickbaity news stuff on South Africa. They're an independent organization. Great guys. Please check them out. I'll throw the link in the description when I'm done with this stream, which is not going to be long, I promise you, because I have work to do in about 10, 15 minutes. But the long and short of it is that you've got really no way out that's with a national coalition. It's all going to come down to extra parliamentary politics. The road to Cape Independence, there's a lovely sort of outline of it on the CIAG's website. That is the Cape Independence Advocacy Group. Go look them up. Phil Craig has got an absolutely stellar strategy, which doesn't even depend on the cooperation of the ANC. And what we're really dealing with now is an existential crisis, and there are solutions that are available. And if you're in the DA and you want to do this, if you want to get involved, just talk to people in your party. Say, like, guys, we need to back Cape Independence. It's important, There's not much else to do. And in the rest of the country, the thing that you'd need to do is you need to start talking to people in civil society and start talking about a tax revolt. Because right now, I mean, look, there's no real major way to deal with it. And the big guys to talk about with the Anchor Town sort of strategy, that would be Solidariteit, AfriForum, those guys. Everything's going to be a really, really big trip. But I have some intelligence that I can't share the origin of, that sort of says that in terms of expropriation or compensation, there is some capacity to prevent that from happening. Obviously, it won't be enough to prevent, let's say, an all-out war. But then, as we know, looking at the riots in 2021, there's not really any capacity in this country to do any kind of organized uprising for very long. And the middle class really is much more organized and resilient than the masses are, and than the government are. So, Lovey, I'll be done in 5 minutes.
When's the power went off?
I think in 15. Okay. But anyway, I'll just do a couple of questions from you guys, and then I'm going to duck. Thankfully, there are not too many questions. So, shame, James. Little Jim James. Anyway. Someone says, sorry, not exactly related, but what do you think of the Suidlanders? I suspect them of being involved with state intelligence and potentially a honey trap organization. But it's hard to tell with these things. I mean, there's a lot of reason to suspect the Avia beer with that as well. And then, so Robert King says, this is the one I laughed at earlier. He says, DA-ANC coalition was yesterday's news. Now the DA is telling us that they stand a chance at obtaining a majority. Well, I mean, like the United States would have to throw them several dozen $1 billion for that kind of campaign, wouldn't they? Anyway, Iron Duke asks what's happening with the IFP these days in KwaZulu-Natal. Well, they're growing pretty fast. Since the RET faction has lost their grip in the ANC, and they were put down really hard after the riots in 21. They're feeling very aggrieved, and a lot of Zulu are moving over to the IFP, and so the IFP are likely going to be able to form a coalition with the DA in that province in 2024. Which will be a superb idea. And if the DA just all of a sudden had a stroke of genius, what they would do is organize for independence in both provinces. And then if I was the United States, what I would do is back both Cape independence and Zulu independence, and continue my support of the Mozambican government, ring fence all of the main ports for mineral export from the interior, and basically force the government to capitulate and reform on our terms. But I don't think the United States is necessarily going to do that unless the stream magically makes its way into Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis' inbox. So that's it. Jesse Randolph says, I don't think most coloureds want Cape Independence. Well, I think over half of them do by the polls. So anyway, that's it for me. be I don't know, go out there and try and convince someone that, to get moving on more radical proposals than horse trading, because otherwise it's going to be, the city of Tshwane at, all of those horrible shenanigans. It's going to be happening at a national scale with, much higher stakes. So, yeah, good luck, God bless, and don't die of fright, I suppose.